Detectives use clues like footprints and fingerprints to connect suspects to a crime that's been committed. But what if there's another kind of evidence that criminals leave behind? Psychological traces that an astute detective can pick up on and use to create a portrait of what a perp is like. Of course, what I'm describing is psychological profiling. It was made famous in The Silence of the Lambs and in the TV show Mindhunter. That was a show that aired on Netflix for 2 seasons. Mindhunter was about the formation of the FBI's behavioral science unit in the 1970s and the dawn of psychological profiling. Today, I want to try to apply that same idea to the disappearance of MH370. Now, a lot of people feel like they already know who the perpetrator is. They think that this kind of exercise is unnecessary. I mean, if you already know who the perp is, then you can basically explain away any aspect of the case just by assuming, well, if he did it, he must have had some reason for doing it. So it doesn't really make any sense to try to do a psychological profile. Crazy people do crazy things. There's really no more to it than that. Shrug. But there's a big problem with assuming that the pilot did it. I've mentioned this before. The big problem is that the pilot suicide scenario is the default scenario. It's what we've been working under for the last 11 years, and it has quite notably failed to find the plane. We can't assume that that theory is correct because so far that theory's predictions have failed to pan out. So unless we're going to shrug and just passively accept failure, we need to interrogate our assumptions. Let's start with a blank slate, throw away our preconceptions, and look at what we can tell about the psychology of the perpetrators solely from the nature of the actions that were taken. So today we're going to look at some key undisputed facts about the case and talk about what we can infer from them about the psychology of whoever took MH370. Hi, everybody. Jeff Wise here, back with you for another episode of Finding MH370. Today, let's start at the beginning of the diversion. Okay, it's 17/19/30. Zaharie Ahmad Shah radios to Kuala Lumpur Control, says, "Good night, Malaysia 370. Now, that is at 7/19/30. At 17:20/31, so 1 minute and 1 second later, the plane passes Igari. Now, note that MH370 didn't actually fly over the waypoint. It flew past it, as you can see in this clip from Victor's blog. 17:20/33, the last detection of the secondary radar by Vietnamese controllers. So that indicates that the electronics are being shut off just mere seconds after the plane has passed by Igari. And 17:20/34, last ADS-B transmission. 17:20/36 was the last detection of the Mode S transponder symbol on Malaysian air traffic control radar. So within 2 to 5 seconds, the plane goes electronically dark with the ADS-B and the Mode S transponder being turned off, causing the plane to disappear from air traffic control radars. So what we have here is a timing so tight that I don't think it can plausibly be viewed as accidental. The plane, it's flown past the last waypoint in Malaysian airspace, and it immediately goes dark, like immediately. So what does that tell us about the perp? I think it's worth noting here that Igari, as I said, is the last waypoint in Malaysia, and as such, it's very important in airspace terms. Beyond this point, Kuala Lumpur is not going to be paying any attention to it anymore, and the next controller at Ho Chi Minh has not yet picked them up, so they're not on Ho Chi Minh's radar either. What the perp has achieved is that they have entered an in-between phase where they were expecting no one to be paying attention to them. So when they pull that 180-degree turn, which we'll talk about next, this would be a very dramatic thing for an airliner flying to Beijing to do. But no one's going to notice that something's wrong for several minutes because they have done this in this kind of liminal space, this in-between space. What are the implications of that from a psychological perspective? Well, we can tell that a key attribute of the perp is that they are evasive. They are evading attention. They're doing something without being seen in the present tense. An important part of evasion that I want to underline is that evasion requires an expectation of others, of the ones who you think are going to be watching you, in this case, the air traffic controllers. When will they be looking, and when will they be looking away? Evasion requires expectation of others, and an expectation of what those others are expecting of you. And that requires two other things that I think we can describe the perp as having. These qualities, they are perceptive and they are knowledgeable. Perceptive because before they exploited this gap in air traffic control surveillance, they were clever enough to perceive that it existed. They had to have a model of the system that was watching them. And they were knowledgeable about air traffic control. They knew that this procedure existed. They knew what the expectations were. They knew that there would be a gap before Ho Chi Minh started to wonder what happened. This is someone who knows about how the system works. So as you can see, there's a lot we can tell about the psychology of the perpetrator just from that single first action. So let's look at what happens next to see what else we can figure out. Okay, fact number 2, the turn back. So very soon after the plane went dark, it makes a hard left turn, makes a 180 and flies back towards Peninsular Malaysia, whence it had come. This is not someone, this is not something that's being carried out by a person who's torn with indecision, right? This is someone who, to all appearances, has been waiting for the moment to come and acted decisively when it did come. So decisive. What else? Ruthless. The perp has just stolen an airliner with 238 other people on board. This is a kidnapping at best, mass murder at worst. This is a major crime that's just been committed. So it's safe to say that this person or group of people are not filled with qualms about hurting their fellow human beings. And there's another thing too, which is this turn suggests that whatever they wanted to do couldn't be achieved by flying straight ahead. They had to turn around and fly to the west. What that is, we'll have to discuss. Okay, fact number 3, acceleration. Based on primary radar data, after the plane pulled the U-turn, it accelerated as it overflew the Malaysian peninsula so that it was flying significantly faster than 777s normally go. That meant that it was burning more fuel. That would affect the range. There's a cost. Even if you're not paying money, there's a cost to flying faster. So why? Why would they fly fast? To me, this means that the hijacker was motivated. They had a goal that they cared deeply about and that they had to get somewhere to accomplish, and that gave them a sense of urgency. What is the goal? What do they want to achieve that's time sensitive? To be clear, the goal is not to commit suicide. I mean, maybe we can imagine that committing suicide is part of this whole operation, maybe the ultimate goal of the operation, but doing all of these things are not necessary to commit suicide. That is, that you could do that just by pointing the plane in the ground from the get-go. There's something else. There's some other goal that these actions are for. And again, we'll talk about that some more a little bit later. Okay, fact number 4, Butterworth. As it overflies the Malayan Peninsula, the plane passes over Butterworth Air Force Base, which it's an interesting place, actually. It's home not only to the Royal Malaysian Air Force, also to the Royal Australian Air Force. In fact, it's the only permanent Australian Air Force base outside of the borders of Australia. So it's a significant and interesting spot in military terms. This is home to Malaysia's number 18 squadron, which is equipped with FA-18 Hornet aircraft, a very capable fighter plane, which is also in frontline service with the U.S. Navy, even today, 11 years later. Personnel at the base also controlled a modern RAT-31DL air defense radar located on Penang, which is where the plane flew next. This is a radar made by the defense conglomerate Leonardo. The brochure says, quote, the RAT-31DL is an advanced L-band solid-state active phased radar, 3D surveillance radar, effective to a range of over 500 kilometers. The RAT-31DL is operational all over the world and is a standing point, I don't know what that means, for the air defense in many countries, including a large number of NATO member nations. This is from Leonardo's own brochure. So flying over an airbase stocked with fighter planes and then over a modern air defense radar installation is a very different kind of move from going electronically dark. In this case, they are not being evasive. They're not shy about being detected. In fact, at this phase of the operation, it seems more like they wanted to make sure that they're being detected. And that's really remarkable and kind of strange, but worth bearing in mind. Why would you want to hide one moment and then flaunt your location the next? I think it suggests that they wanted to be not to be observed in real time by someone who could, potentially raise the alarm and bring scrutiny what they were doing in the present tense, maybe even do something to stop it, but that they actually wanted what they were doing to be recorded in a way that would be discovered later. Again, why? To be discussed. Okay, here comes a biggie. This is fact number 5, the reboot. I have talked endlessly about the reboot, as anyone who's seen other episodes of this podcast will know. The perp waits until after the last primary radar return and then reboots the satellite data unit. Again, we have what appears to be a tight synchronicity. Only about a minute elapses from leaving primary radar coverage to someone restoring power to the SDU. And this in turn creates the signals that will later indicate to investigators where the plane went. If that timing isn't coincidental and just as occurred by chance, if it was intentional, it reinforces what we observed from fact number 1, that this is a tightly planned and executed attack. So the perp is perceptive, knowledgeable, and aggressive. Now, I've done whole episodes on the reboot of the SDU and how it could have been done. But the 2 key facts to know from a Mindhunter perspective is that the rebooting SDU is something that means that the perp is, first of all, technically sophisticated. I've talked to many pilots about this. Almost every 777 pilot I've ever met since 2014, I've asked about this. Rebooting the SDU is not something that any 777 pilot knows how to do. The documentation, yes, is out there in the world that a motivated perp could find out and read and figure out how to do it, but it would require knowledge and sophistication that the vast majority of 777 pilots do not have at any given moment. Okay, another thing, a really telling psychological aspect of the perp is a non-pilot mindset. What do I mean by that? I've also asked a lot of 777 pilots, including Juan Brown and Ron Rogers, who I had really delightful interviews with earlier in the podcast, whether they would want to do something like isolate the left AC bus for any reason, which is how you would have to, this laborious and difficult and kind of complicated way that you could turn off the SDU from the cockpit. And the answer is always an unequivocal no. This is just something that lies way beyond what a 777 pilot would consider a reasonable course of action. So whoever carried out this act was operating way outside the realm of how a 777 pilot thinks. Okay, what else? Motivated. Rebooting the SDU is difficult and it is dangerous in the sense that anyone who does it, who is not a Boeing engineer, is going to face consequences that they may not have anticipated. So whoever rebooted the SDU must have done it for a reason. What that reason is very far from clear. Some YouTubers have speculated that Zaharie took the plane and wanted to be really, really sure that it didn't send out any kind of electronic signals, any kind of electronic clue as to what he was doing. And so he turned off the plane's entire electrical system so that, to prevent the SATCOM from sending out any signals at all. This explanation doesn't hold any water, in my estimation. Why? Because remember, at the time the SDU was turned off, they were flying right over a major Malaysian Air Force base. Okay, let's talk about expectation. What would the perp expect in flying over an Air Force base? Were they trying to not be seen, or were they trying to make sure they were seen, to remove any doubt that their presence would be noticed after the fact, after the deed had already been done, when investigators were trying to figure out what had happened? And finally, let's look at one last aspect of this case that tells us something about the psychology of the perp. And that is fact number 6, the long flight. After the SDU rebooted, the plane flew on for another 6 hours. Again, this is motivated behavior. There was something evidently that they wanted to achieve, or a place that they were trying to get to. And in order to achieve that goal, they were able to exert self-control. They were patient. You might think that patience is the opposite of decisiveness, which we met in fact 1. One means acting quickly and the other means acting slowly. But I really think of them as allied characteristics. They both reflect a perp who has a plan and who is willing to do what it takes to carry it out. They both signify motivation and self-control. Now, someone could say, maybe the perp wasn't patient. Maybe they just committed suicide and the plane, flew on as a ghost flight. We know that that wasn't the case because they had to have engaged in maneuvers at the end of the flight. Again, that's a subject for another podcast episode, but it has been pretty much conclusively established that this was not a ghost flight. Someone sat there for 6 hours. Okay, so I think that what I've just laid out is the bulk of what we can deduce about the psychology of the perps, assuming nothing at all about what the identity of the perp, who they were, who it was, who he was, whatever. And let me just run through that list again. Evasive, perceptive, knowledgeable, decisive, motivated, technically sophisticated, with a non-pilot mindset, and patient. When I look at all of those characteristics together, I see an actor who's highly motivated and capable and who wants to achieve something. And part of the plan involves engaging in deception and evasion. They deceived the air traffic controllers in the present tense by going dark at Agari during the brief window of time when no one was looking at them. Deception is a game of expectations. What does the perp expect the victim to expect? The deceiver wants the victim to believe A when reality is B. The discrepancy is the essence of deception, and the deceiver creates it in order to fill their own purpose, which kind of by definition is at odds with the will of the victim. So at Agari, air traffic controllers expected the plane to be, flying along its assigned path through Ho Chi Minh's airspace. When it didn't appear, they assumed that it must have just been delayed. They had an understandable expectation that things were unfolding exactly as they had for every single flight of every single day for years and years and years. And the perps understood that the expectation was there and they were able to exploit it to fulfill their purpose. Of course, deception is very common in crime. Criminals often want to do things that other people do not want them to do, like steal their stuff. To me, the incident that this most closely resembles is 9/11. You had very clever, ruthless, sophisticated, determined attackers who were able to surprise their victims because they acutely perceived what the victim's expectations were and how those expectations could be subverted. In particular, until that time, hijackers had never gone through the trouble of taking over planes and then just killed themselves as part of the plan. So the fact that hijackers would be willing to do that was a shock. both hijackers and law enforcement authorities assumed that it would not be worth it up to that time to go through the effort of carrying out a hijacking if you were just going to die in the process. When 9/11 happened, it turned out that that assumption was wrong, that there were some people whose worldview and motivation was such that they were willing to die for the sake of achieving their goals. In this case, their goal was pretty clear. They wanted to bring death and destruction to the United States and to trigger a disproportionate response that would wind up harming our position in the world, which it did. It was a very successful operation. I get that people don't like the 9/11 attackers, but you have to give them, you have to acknowledge that they succeeded beyond, I think, their own expectations, frankly. Those outside attackers had to be clever and deceptive because they needed to take over a plane that was previously under someone else's control. There was significant, measures in place to prevent that. Once their plan was complete, it was absolutely shocking. I remember vividly how incomprehensible it was that such a thing had happened. It lay so far outside of everyone's expectations. So for days, I was living in LA at the time. I had moved from New York to LA, and so I had a lot of connections to New York. And even in LA, where we were 3,000 miles away from what had happened, everyone was kind of wandering around in a daze, asking ourselves, how could this happen? It didn't seem possible. So in contrast, when pilots hijack their own planes to commit suicide, pilots don't have a particularly clever plan because they start out in control. They can do whatever they want, whenever they want. At most, they have to overcome their co-pilot, which Andreas Lubitz did by simply locking the cockpit door after the captain went out for a bathroom break. So in all other cases of pilot suicide that we know about, we don't see anything like this degree of careful, meticulous planning, for a complicated plan. The one case where we see a bit of effort is in Silk Air, where it seems that the pilot left the cockpit, pulled circuit breakers on the black boxes before diving into the surface. Apparently, there was a little bit of deception there. He didn't, as far as we can tell, it seems like he didn't want to be fingered as the culprit. And there is some ambiguity. We don't really know for sure that he did it because of that the absence of black box data. But there was none of the care, the elaborateness, the discipline, the patience, etc., that we saw in both MH370 and 9/11. Okay, but what if Zaharie was just as motivated as the 9/11 hijackers were? If that's the case, you have to ask yourself, what was he motivated for? What was his goal? Because all that was achieved was a plane disappeared. And it didn't just disappear. It vanished in a way that he himself could not have anticipated. Zaharie could not have possibly known about the Inmarsat BFO and BTO values that the investigators would later use to define the search zone. So he could not have flown the plane in such a way as to avoid the search area and crash landed somewhere else. If his goal was to disappear the plane, he just got really, really lucky and had nothing to do with the other stuff that we've been talking about. Okay, so let's imagine, just for the sake of argument, let's imagine that disappearing the plane was his goal. Why? Why does he want to disappear the plane? What's the goal behind the goal? And I have to say, it's been 11 years and I have yet to hear a coherent explanation of why Zaharie would be motivated to do the things he supposedly did. One theory is that he wanted to send a message to the Malaysian government, which he didn't like, with good reason. It was pretty corrupt. Okay, but what is the message? What a plane vanishes. No one can say why or what happened. It's very unclear what that message is supposed to mean. In the aftermath, it did not cause a big blowback against the Malaysian government. So if that was his intention, it certainly didn't bear fruit. And if he wanted to leave a message, he could have left a message. He could have said, I hate this government. I'm killing all the people on this plane. Didn't happen. Another theory is that he wanted to go down in history as the greatest criminal mastermind of all time. Okay, but a mastermind of what? That he wanted to make the plane disappear so completely that the crime would be unsolvable? Well, if the crime was unsolvable, then they wouldn't be able to finger him. Therefore, he wouldn't be famous. All right, let someone else have a say here. I want to read you something that one of the YouTube commenters wrote a couple days ago. At DFKMSC wrote, I also think that while it would be prolonged suicide at that high of altitude when he would take the oxygen mask off, it would be peaceful death like falling asleep, and his effort to conceal what truly happened to the plane could have made him feel it was way less likely the finger would be pointed at him, thus saving his family's shame. He would also go out doing the thing he was passionate about, flying a plane. Yes, he would die doing the thing he loved. I want to clarify something here. I love to fly little planes. I do not love to crash little planes. It is something I really, really want to avoid. And so if I ever crash a plane, God forbid, I don't want anyone to say that I died doing what I love, because I love to fly. I don't love to crash. One man's opinion. Okay. But more to the point, as a result of everything that happened the way it did, Zaharie is far and away the number one suspect. In fact, as far as the official investigators are concerned, he's the only suspect. Because where do you fly the plane from? The cockpit. And who is in the cockpit? Zaharie. Case closed. So going through a super elaborate, complicated, difficult, and dangerous scheme in order to get away scot-free simply does not make any sense. Everything that night pointed to Zaharie as the culprit. A sophisticated and daring culprit, yes, but he certainly did not pull off the perfect crime. He cast a pall of suspicion over himself, and his family is still living under that pall today. Everyone assumes that he did it. So he was super successful in every regard, except in achieving anything that could reasonably be construed as a goal. To which some people have responded, okay, but he was crazy. He was suicidal. He didn't care about anything. We shouldn't expect him to be pursuing goals rationally. Okay, sure. But look at this list again. Perceptive, knowledgeable, decisive, motivated, technically sophisticated. This is not someone crazily flailing about. This is not someone who's gone off the rails and is acting incoherently, crazily. This is someone drafting and meticulously carrying out a plan with a goal different from just killing yourself. This is a real non-trivial mystery. Okay, let's take a run at this from another direction. Here are two facts from what we've learned today. Number one, the operation was carried out by means of deception, at least in part. Two, the operation left the authorities with the unshakable impression that Zaharie was the culprit. What I want to leave you with today is a suggestion that we combine these two ideas. That the operation relied on deception to create the impression that Zaharie was the culprit. And that consequently Zaharie was not the culprit, but was merely framed by means of deception. And that all of these attributes, evasive, perceptive, knowledgeable, aggressive, decisive, ruthless, motivated, technically sophisticated, non-pilot-minded, patient, actually best describes not a suicidal pilot, but a well-equipped, trained, and motivated third-party hijackers. So if there's any possibility, any vulnerability that could have been exploited to make such an operation possible, I think it makes a lot more sense from a Mindhunter perspective. Okay, everybody, thanks for tuning in. That's all I have for you today. I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions on this topic. This is me riffing on what I see. I would love to hear what you think. Plausible, implausible? What can we make of the actions that took place on that day? Leave the comments here or visit the show page at findingmh370.com, where, of course, you can get sign up for a regular newsletter that goes out with each episode. And you can also get a paid membership if you want to support the podcast, which is great if you do. For now, this is Jeff Wise saying, see you next time.